So thank you guys for letting me talk. I don't do this very much, so this is kind of a test to see how many people walk out before the end. It's only an hour. I told Katie when I got up there, we watched a comedian recently, and I said, it's going to feel like stand-up comedy, only it's not going to be funny at all. So who's going to stay there? I don't know. But I think my hook is I like to aim high, and so the hook here is that I am bringing today the antidote to all evil. All the evil that you see, yes, all the evil you see in the world, which we'll get into, this is the answer. I didn't come up with it. Yeshua came up with it, but. So this is my first 3-point speech. I didn't know what that was, and Katie was like, you have to look up what a 3-point speech is. And it's, you're supposed to make 3 points, but I have more than that. So since I have 5, I'm going to summarize the 5 in 4 so you know where we're going, so you don't get totally bored as I ramble. The first thing is why we're going to hit these 5 points. I'll only give you 4 to keep something away from you. The first one is, why do good people do bad things? This is a big question. It's been a big question since the beginning of last century, 1900s, especially since the Nazis, the USSR. It's a question today. We'll get into that a little. The second is why the state loves popular Christian theology. We'll find out. Why the church is susceptible to the overbearing tyranny of the state. Why is that? What can we do to change it is the last point. Well, that's the last point I'll tell you about now. So we'll start with good people do evil. Okay. No, I just ended the sentence. No, you're good. He fixed Max's sword yesterday that I broke. Thank you. So, why do good people do evil? This is the question. And another question that a lot of people have is, what would you do if you were there, like in the shoes of the Nazis, who are confronted with the decision whether they will help operate the country, whether they will be complicit. So what decision will you make then? All right, so there is a video here, and what this guy is going to tell us about, let me tell you one second about him. His name is Maajid Nawaz, and he was an ex-Islamist, like a Muslim extremist, and he had a change of heart in the prison system. But what he does now is he is calling out things that he sees in the government when he sees the government going awry. And so what he's going to talk about, though, is he's going to explain how this woman named Hannah Arendt, who was writer for The New Yorker, she went to the Nuremberg trials, and she was watching everyone get tried for the evil things they did during World War II, and she was totally astounded that everyone there was not like a supervillain. And so there was this particular guy, she went to the trial of a guy named Adolf Eichmann, and he'll tell about this if that video plays. If not, I'll tell it. I guess you could click that play button if you want to, and we'll see if it works. I wasn't able to send him the PowerPoint. I just had to do the Google Drive thing. So we're trusting Google.
Hannah Arendt is a German Jewish philosopher, she wrote about the rise of totalitarianism in Germany to try and understand it. In fact, was one of the leading and first philosophers to try and dissect totalitarianism and how it emerged. And she coined this theory, which is, everybody can look it up. It's called the banality of evil. And her basic point was, she ended up living her final years in Israel, and she was really interested in understanding how ordinary, everyday, nice people became Nazis. Yeah? And the banality of evil is her theory that explains it. And the point was that actually good people can do evil things. And they don't even realize they're doing them. And it's incremental. It's step by step. And each incremental step is justified for the common good. Until like a proverbial frog being boiled alive in water, and because it's a frog and its skin temperature changes with the water, it doesn't realize it's being boiled alive until it's too late and it dies with the boiling water. It doesn't jump out. So take that proverb, that story, and apply it to Hannah Arendt's theory of the banality of evil. That if you incrementally change, step by step, you change society, before you even realize it, you've got to a point that it's past the point of no return.
Okay, the last bit he said, I think I started it. Okay. The last bit he said is important. and we'll touch on it more, because what he's saying is, why do they do it? Why do they do it? And so he kind of jumped ahead of us. It's because, we'll get into it more, but it's because they think that they're not doing something evil. They think that they're doing something for the greater good. And then we'll find out why they think that. So Adolf Eichmann, he's the everyman, basically, quote unquote, according to this woman who was observing his trial. And his history is that he was the guy that was sending the Jews onto the train cars and like doing all the logistics to get them to the end destination, which was where they would die. And he just, according to her, was this unassuming guy. He wasn't Dr. Evil. Like, she expected him to be a supervillain, and he seemed relatively normal. And also, his plea with the Nuremberg court that he wasn't really guilty, that he should be pardoned, was that it wasn't his responsibility for his actions, because he was just following orders. He was doing what the generals told him to do. He was doing what eventually Hitler told him to do. And so it wasn't his fault, and that's it. And that really was the plea across the Nuremberg trials. And basically, they decided that's not good enough. But that's what he was saying. He was saying that. And so this is a reenactment of how that journalist, Hannah Arendt, watched the trial and what conclusion she came to try and make sense of it. It's not too long, I don't think. Sorry, Sean, I'm making you do all this work. We're just starting.
In refusing to be a person, Eichmann utterly surrendered that single most defining human quality, that of being able to think. And consequently, he was no longer capable of making moral judgments. This inability to think created the possibility for many ordinary men to commit evil deeds on a gigantic scale, the like of which one had never seen before. It is true. I have considered these questions in a philosophical way. The manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge, but the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly. And I hope that thinking gives people the strength to prevent catastrophes in these rare moments when the chips are down. In refusing to be...
Sorry. She hopes that thinking will... She hopes that you can observe what happened in history and learn from it and think and say, okay, I won't do that. But she's wrong. Sadly, she's wrong, because we've seen this happen again. It's happening now. Anyway, philosophy and intellect without Yah won't get us to the antidote to evil. All it's going to do is allow us to look back and say, oh man, those people were not like me. They were very different than me. I'm very different than them. But let's do one more. I want to do one more dive into how far secular philosophy got, and science and psychology got to, like, figuring out why people will do evil things, especially when authority figures tell them to. You can play it, I guess.
One of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology was carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He conducted an experiment focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. In 1963, Milgram examined justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. Their defense often was based on obedience, that they were just following orders from their superiors. Milgram devised the experiment to answer the question: could it be that those who committed such atrocities in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Milgram wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures. as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by a newspaper, advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person, and they drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher, and the learner was an actor hired, pretending to be a real participant. The learner, who was an actor called Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and researcher went into a room next door that contained an electric shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, which is a slight shock, to 375 volts, which had a danger reading of severe shock, and up to 450 volts, which is enough to kill a human being.
Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants were comprised of 40 males aged between 20 and 50, whose job ranged from unskilled to professional. They were paid $4.50 just for turning up to the study. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to the other participant, which was the actor, taking on the role as the learner. The experimenter, who was also an actor, was dressed in a grey lab coat, played by an actor, not Milgram himself. 2 rooms in the Yale laboratory were used, one for the learner with an electric chair, and another for the teacher and the experimenter with an electric shock generator. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was strapped to a chair by electrodes. After he had learned a list of paired words given to him to learn, the teacher tests him by naming a word and then asking the learner to recall its partner or pair from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose, and for each of one of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology, was carried out by Stanley Milgram.
Basically, I'm going to skip it because it's way longer than I thought, but I'll tell you what happens. What happens is that everyone shocked them up to 350 volts, and 66% of the people shocked them up to 450 volts. Basically, they would have killed them if this were really happening, since it was just an act, a play act, and no one died, no one got hurt. But the idea was, were they willing to do it? And this was just a random grab of people here in America. So, very weird that we're willing to do this. And so the experimenters came up with kind of 2, this is the idea. If we have an authority figure instructing them that it's okay to go ahead and shock them, and they would use 3 phrases. One is, the experiment requires that you continue. And then another one was like, you must continue. And they would just do it. So it gets to the question, would we do it? All right, number 2 is, they have the figure in authority accept responsibility for that thing. Does this sound familiar to Eichmann's defense? Okay, so as believers in Yah, we probably think immediately we would not do this because, these people weren't Christians. They weren't. But the Nazis were Christians, actually. The majority of the Germans in World War II were Christians. And so here's the stat. 40 million were Protestants, 20 million were Catholics, okay. But, they did believe. They believed something. Even Hitler says we will tolerate no one in our ranks who attacks the ideas of Christianity. In fact, our movement is Christian. So as far, all right, it's a fluid definition of Christian then, isn't it? So actually, to give the full picture, the Nazi Party created what they called positive Christianity. And it was Christianity without a lot of the things that they didn't like in the Bible, which happened to be, and this is where we're getting to the actual truth of this thing today, they rejected the whole Old Testament. They actually tried to remove everything that they thought was written by a Jew, even though that would be the whole thing, I think, for the most part. I guess a Benjamite, he wrote, maybe they kept Paul. They only kept. So I say the only way Christian morals can gel with those of an ever more perverse state is by removing the Torah, the law of Yah, in which good and evil are spelled out in absolute terms. So as much as the Christian church loses that and connection with that, and I'll probably hammer this way too much, but that's the point of all this. As much as we lose connection with that, we lose the foundation of the faith, and we lose our ability to withstand an authority figure, the state, when pressure is cranked up. Okay, so it wasn't just the Nazis, just so we're not only picking on them, because the church in the Soviet Union did the same thing. I mean, they were under massive pressure because the Soviet Union did not call themselves a Christian nation. But the church, their Russian Orthodox Church, made this statement. They said, the church, it has limited religious functions and does not feel itself called upon to criticize the state. So basically, they weren't going to stand up. This was their way of saying, no, just go on. There's nothing to see over here. Now, thank goodness that America would never push its morality on us. Aren't you glad that you live? Okay, good. The truth is, this is point number 2, finally, the state will constantly push its morality on its citizens. The reason it does it is so that it can shape our world, so it can shape reality. Because if it can get us, if it can convince us that something is right or something is wrong, then we will listen, okay? Now, I think a lot of you probably know all of this stuff, but I'm trying to I'm trying to show all the work. Postmodernism is a branch of philosophy that kind of gained ground here and through the Western nations. And it basically, you could read all that, but what it tells you is that it's all about moral relativism. It's all about the chair's not here. Are you here? Is there right? Is there wrong? And you can't prove any of it. You can't prove it is. You can't prove it's not. It's all relative. Okay, that's bad. Now, Majid, again, we're back to this guy because he's really good at explaining this, how states have adopted relativity. And so I'll let him talk about this part, when truth is relative. I can play it. I did it.
The truth is relative and it serves a purpose. What happens when you do that? When there's no such thing as truth, you can't define reality. And when you can't define reality, the only thing that matters is power. You're a father. Now, we're your child. Children who can't reason, like my kid's 5. I mean, his reasoning abilities are great, but he's 5, right? It's why you say to the child, because I said so, do it. It's good for you. Because they don't know how to reason yet. Yeah? And you try, and if something's too complex, you say, I'll explain another time, but right now you have to listen to your father, don't do this. When there's no such thing as truth, because everything's relative, the only thing that matters is power, because power gets to define reality. And this brings us to the hybrid war we're in right now. And that's why people that are in power, who are seeking a specific outcome from the world that we're in, want to shut debate down. What they're not interested in is seeking truth. What they're interested in is shutting that debate down, because power steps into that void when reason no longer exists and gets to define reality for you from up above. And it's why it's so important in a dictatorship that the only thing you have left when all your power is taken from you is the truth. And if you read Orwell, if you look at 1984, it's why he spends so much time talking about how the power he was writing about in that fictional account is attempting to redefine reality, redefine the past, redefine the future. Because if you can't hold on to reality, you have no premise to scrutinize the government for whether they're telling you the truth or not. And it is a war in that sense, hybrid war. So information in that war becomes your most powerful weapon. Now, most people don't have the privilege of researching these debates, foreign policy, war on terror, COVID, whatever it is. People don't have the privilege because they're working 9 to 5, a minimum wage, and they're hungry and they're just busy trying to live and survive. What they normally do is they outsource their thinking on where the truth lies to trusted voices in the media. So it's why it becomes so important to manipulate the media, so that those trusted voices that people are looking to are no longer giving them at least the best understanding of the truth they have, but are also peddling the agenda of power. When you're in a situation like that, it becomes difficult to define reality and therefore difficult to challenge government. on whether or not they are sticking to their promises, because everything gets shifted, everything's relative. The Overton window keeps moving. The goalposts keep shifting. If you remember, back at the beginning of this, we were told 2 weeks, whatever it was.
Flatten the curve.
Flatten the curve, yeah? Now look at us 2 years later, and we're here still.
Okay. So he kind of helps bring it up to today, and I'll just continue to bring it to today. Is he right? Has the state created our reality by creating our morality? Here's one example. Here's the morality that's created. You have to stay at home so you don't kill your grandmother. It's the moral thing to do. This is moral. And it's like, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, I really need to not kill my grandma because I love her. So, okay, I accept that morality. And then I stay at home. That's the result. Reality is created. What else will we do? Will we wear a mask? Will we stay indoors? Will we out our neighbors? Will we adhere to a curfew? Will we present our papers? And so Majid goes on to talk about going from a democracy to a papers, please society in the matter of like a year or a couple years. And he says, how did we get there? So, and that's the question, what would we not do? And also, what can we do? So the best way to fight the state's morality is to have external sovereign morality. You have to have a morality, a set of standards. You have to have your own conscience that is not shaped by the conscience handed down to you by any authority figure, right now, the state. So where do we get those moral structures? Usually they come from religion. And that's why totalitarian governments, that's why communists do not like religion, because it gives you some kind of identity, a strong identity, and a strong reason for saying no. Here is a quote from the CCP, I think. They say, it's only one important part. The CCP authority, China's most concerned about religion when they think it can foster a turn away from party ideology. So whenever religion is strong enough to strengthen people enough to say, I would rather do this than do what you're telling me to do, that's when it's dangerous. So I'd like to visit another example back in the day, where the Catholic Church did the same thing. So before there was the state shaping our reality by shaping our morality, there was the church, the Catholic Church, the universal church, that was, once they realized that they could have the full hold on the translation of the Bible, and then they knew that they could hand down what the Bible says, what's true, what's not true. And of course, it seems a little too obvious, but they did. They used it to create indulgences where you have to pray for your loved ones who are dead, but if you don't, they're going to stay in purgatory, a place not that good. It's not hell, but it's purgatory. They weren't quite good enough to make it to heaven. They weren't a saint. So, and you have to pay for that too. So that was a huge thing that the reformers railed against, and that is what the Reformation helped kill. So the Reformation totally upended the religion of the day, and the massive power structure that was formed by the Catholic Church. It wasn't easy, and a lot of people died horrendous deaths doing it. Not that I don't want this to be a foreshadowing, I'm just saying. But the Reformation dispelled the Catholic Church's top-down, falsified reality by restoring some level of biblical truth. And with it, righteousness and love. Obviously, we think that, oh wait, a side note, this article is still about indulgences and praying your friend's souls out of purgatory, and it was just updated on April 2nd of this year. I wanted you guys to see that. So, okay, that's bad. And we saw what the answer was. The answer was going back to the Bible. I won't get into the fact that we have some differences between the reformers, but I'll get into that later. The new papacy today is the state, is in each Western nation. The state shapes our lives by depriving us information, if it can. Like the White House sanctions fact checkers on Facebook and Twitter, if you guys are aware of this. A lot of the canceling and the banning and this sort of stuff comes from a joint, power relationship between the state and large corporations. Why? And I didn't want to mention this, but that's why it's so cool to see Elon Musk maybe trying to take over Twitter. So who knows? See, there are rays of light. Let me see. So what is, another example of this is political correctness. Like, you guys remember first hearing this word, or at least I do, and that term, political correct, is like a spectrum. It's a moving target that has shifted since I first remember hearing it to today. And what I mean by that is this. All these terms that Max won't let me say, because he'll yell at me from the seats, they originated as scientific labels for mental syndromes or whatever, and then they became insults. It became, and then at the bottom, you can't read it, and neither can I, but part 2, it says, you shouldn't call anyone this anymore, it's not nice, basically. They've said, they've disallowed the use of these words, probably for good reason in that case, but same thing seems to be happening with gender, weirdly, where the shifting political correctness has moved to, like, calling a biological man or woman now a wrong thing to do. And this is kind of just a joke. What is next? Will they call Christian dated and offensive? That's what that says in the top. But I actually photoshopped that, so don't worry about that right now. So let's move on. The church is susceptible to the state's moral decay because it abandoned its claim on absolute truth. And that's what I mentioned before. But how does that happen? When we lose the Bible's definitions of words, very important words, sin, love, right, wrong, then the definitions have to be filled by someone, somehow, some way, and the state loves doing it, but the church seems to do it too. And when the church does it, if it were consistent, that would be one thing. But when the church is redefining words that are already defined in the Bible, 1, that's a problem, and 2, it's not going to be consistent because those definitions are going to vary by individual and by denomination. And they do. They do. So Reformation 1.0 was the answer to the Catholic Church's perversion of the truth. Reformation 2.0, I say, is the answer to the modern church's perversion of the truth. This is just going to give you a quick flavor of the relativity that is rampant in the church. Here are 3 pastors who define sin, and at the bottom is the biblical definition of sin. We have John Piper. So my definition of sinning is any feeling or thought or speech or action that comes from a heart that does not treasure God over all things. It's interesting. Maybe he's right. However, it's not a solid explanation of anything. It's so ethereal that it is not useful it's not pragmatically useful in your everyday life. Next, sin is whatever is outside love or whatever is outside faith. Also, another thing, you now have to define love and you have to define faith. Okay, sin is the opposite of God, says Rick Warren. Okay, yes, it probably is. However, now you have to define God, a way more difficult thing to define than sin. He's spiritual. But the actual easy definition, which no one quotes, is that sin is the transgression of the law. We all know this. But the problem that has happened is that it's not just sin it's not just the definition of sin that the church has changed. It's many other things. It's the fact that God is consistent. It's this. Misdefining sin is the start. This guy says, oh my gosh, I got to just read you this quote. Famous pastor, jacked pastor of Elevation Church. So what God did when he sent his son, I hate even reading this, and this is why we get excited in church, and this is why tears fill our eyes when we think about Jesus, and this is why the gospel is still good news in the world today, because God broke the law for love. I said to every sinner, God broke the law for love. Wow. So, what? Okay, for us this registers as wrong. Then there's more. Pete Buttigieg. Whoops, I went too far. He says basically to Pence during his speech, if you have a problem with my gayness, take it up with God. Basically, he's saying, God made me gay, so you got to work that out with him, Mike Pence. I'm trying to show the relativity here. I'm trying to show how far the church has gone. Here, maybe this is the cream on top. Can a minister in a Christian church be an atheist? That's the question facing the United Church of Canada as it wrestles with the case of Greta something or other. So, okay, now it's gone so far from actually the Bible and truth, that the teachers in some churches don't believe that there is a God, a Yah, a creator of the heavens and the earth. This is from a Facebook page called The Christian Left, and they have a website too. They have 300,000 followers, 300,000 people who think that Christians, claim to be Christians, who've clicked the like button on their page, and they just, you just can read this. There's more than this. Basically, they're for abortion, they're for all the stuff we're against. So, now you see what you already knew, the kind of plunge, the spiral down into moral decay that both our state and our church is on the road to. So what's the solution? A lot of us will kind of try and figure out what's going on. And so these guys and many others, and I just threw up pictures, many of the alt media like sounding the alarm to say, hey, look, look what's happening. I think that something's being planned here. I think that there's some kind of agenda here. Okay. But that's not the answer. Awareness is not the antidote, although it's interesting. But exposing evil doesn't kill evil. The Bible tells us there will be a constant battle until Yeshua returns. So what is the answer? This is number 5. Grounding Christians, believers, people call themselves Christians, in the truth, I say is the antidote to evil. This is the second half of the Great Commission. It's like, go forth and, well, it's actually the Great Commission itself. Go forth and make disciples. But that making of disciples and then teaching them everything that I commanded you to teach them, that's the part that needs to really be right. Let me see what I said here. The answer to evil is to turn believers to the forgotten rock of the Word and use it to map out absolute truth as established in the law of Yah, his Torah. The answer is to correct the Great Commission. Okay. Well, I'm arguing it wasn't performed correctly the first time fully. And here, I'll say it out. In its broad strokes, like I say here. The church did a lot of work on the first part of the Great Commission, going into the world, baptizing them, making Christians, right? But they weren't prepared to make the disciples, to make true disciples, and teach them everything Christ taught, as they had some of it backwards or inside out, in my perspective. Not all of it, of course not. Correcting that back to his truth is the missing part. That's what I'm saying. By doing any of it, by not being exactly aligned with what Yeshua was telling them, that they created a structure of morality that was not what Yeshua had, and by doing that, it weakened the faith of so many people that we had 40 million Christian Nazis. That's the point. So, I'm just going to read the Great Commission. And Yeshua came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples, this is the part, of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Okay. Okay, you asked this question, basically. It's like they were doing the Great Commission. Well, I'm saying Christianity, with uncertain definitions of life-altering words such as sin, evil, and love, creates a weaker version of the faith. I guess I already said this. One without a strong enough foundation to resist the pressures of the state. I.e., if we think we have a strong moral code external to the states, and our code is made of breadsticks, then we will fall like the gingerbread man. Now, these guys were grounded in the truth. These guys were grounded in the law. Then what did they do? Moses had so much faith that all of this is true, that Yah was with him, that he left being a prince of Egypt, and he just went off into the wilderness out of faith. He left all the love and joys of the world, all that the world had to give him. And Paul talks about that in Hebrews. And then Daniel faced the lions. All of these things, you know all these stories. This is where we get the inspiration and the grit that comes. This is how we can tap into the power that the Bible can give us, by just being honest about what it says. Okay, so question. Are we Torah observers? Are we doing this? Are we making disciples of believers who already believe that there's a God, a true God in heaven, and that Yeshua died for their sins? Are we going and talking to them and trying to say, hey, there's this other part that I think that the mainstream Christian church is confused about, and can we talk about it? And I know it's not easy, but why aren't we doing it? And I just thought of a list of things. Are we too excited about conspiracy theories? I call it conspiracy voyeurism. Because yes, some of them are true. That's too bad. And when they are true, it's like, oh, that's creepy. But it's also not what our job is. And and then we have the thirst for new knowledge. I'm calling out things in the Hebrew Roots movement right now. You know, it's exciting. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, who doesn't? The thirst for new knowledge, as exemplified in the Torah observant movement, is a constant looking beyond our basic truths and foundations that we have and should be grounded in the Bible, to such an extent that we spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours doing it, when we should be doing what I think is the Great Commission, and making disciples and changing the world. And because the truth is, Yeshua won't come back until we wake up all the lost sheep of the house of Israel and make disciples of them. So we have to make a spotless lamb, and that's our job. No one else is going to do it. And that's what the end of this is going to be. It's that no one else is going to do it. So the others are just regular things that humans do. They're, it's not very easy to love this guy that I know is wrong and love him enough to like get up and go and find him and talk to him. So that's the inertia part. And then also lack of confidence and fear. Like, do I know I'm right? Are my arguments well-grounded? Do I have a good, theological framework that I would just stake every conversation upon? And so those are some of the things that go through our heads, I think. So here's the conclusion. Sorry this took so long. I didn't like plan out how long it would be, but all right, so if you remember that Hannah Arendt, that woman from the beginning, the writer for The New Yorker who went to the Nuremberg trials, she identified this idea, this banality of evil, to describe what happens when people rescind personal responsibility, and with it, their morality and their soul to authority. The state repeatedly proved then and now that it will commandeer our morality and our actions, and in exchange will claim responsibility. It's like, okay, don't worry, we'll take responsibility. However, Eichmann was hanged. You can't very well hang the Nazi Party, but you can hang individuals who do what the Nazi Party says. And we must stand alone before Yah, who will judge us one day. So no matter who's going to take responsibility, we're the ones. The buck stops with all of us, each and every one of us, man, woman, child. What is the very best way to ensure we will stand against the overreach of the state when pressed? Well, if we have a sovereign moral code based on absolute truth, infusing that into others is our profession and the solution to prevent future horror. That's basically it. That's it. I'm saying, and then this last slide is my favorite quote, basically, and it's from the time when all the Ivy League universities actually were reading the Bible in the schools, because they were all founded by Christians. This was the president of Princeton, John Hibben, and this is what he read or spoke out to one of the graduating classes. And I'm going to read it to you. You enlightened, and the reason I'm reading it to you is because I want you all to know, and I want it to be like as far ingrained as I can get it into your souls, that you in the Torah observant movement, your responsibility, in my opinion, is to teach other believers the truth. Okay. You enlightened, self-sufficient, self-governed, endowed with gifts above your fellows. The world expects you to produce as well as consume, to add to and not subtract from its store of good, to build up and not tear down, to ennoble and not degrade. It commands you to take your place and to fight in the name of honor and chivalry against the powers of organized evil and of commercialized vice, against poverty, disease, and death, which follow fast in the wake of sin and ignorance, against all the innumerable forces which are working to destroy the image of God in man and unleash the passions of the beast. There comes to you from many quarters, from many voices, the call of your own kind. It's the human cry of spirits in bondage, of souls in despair, of lives debased and doomed. It's the call of man to his brother. Such is your vocation. Follow the voice that calls you in the name of God and of man. The time is short, the opportunity is great. Therefore, crowd the hours with the best that is in you. So that's it. It's like, come on, let's just do our thing. And you all are, but this is to encourage you all to continue doing it. And to try and show that if you can help your neighbor be strong in his faith, by giving him solid definitions of very important biblical words, then he will be able to better stand against an overbearing government whenever that time may come. And so, yeah, even if you can make a Christian, even if you can make a disciple, even an ordinary Christian who doesn't have the Torah, is way more likely because they have a set of morality external. I'm saying let's try and really improve that set of morality. And that's it. Thank you, guys.